All right, briefly, let me just, I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists. As Laura said, my name is Rachel Feit. I'm the moderator for this session on best management practices and for difficult discoveries. I think I was asked to serve as moderator for this panel, and I'm really just so honored to do so, not only because of my own expertise in Austin history and archaeology of the African diaspora, but also because I've been involved with some complex and really challenging projects where community input and engagement was essential. So in this session, we'll be talking about best management practices, not just in relation to the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel project. And this whole symposium has been fantastic, phenomenal for that. And I really give kudos to the city of Austin for putting this on. But I also hope that we're going to talk about all kinds of heritage projects and best management practice for moving forward. So especially projects that involve aspects where social equity and social justice are underlying concerns. So I'm going to introduce the other panelists real quickly. We've got Sally Victor. Sally is a former heritage resources consultant with expertise on historic cemeteries. She's prepared National Register nominations for a number of historic cemeteries and now gives walking tours and presentations focusing on cemeteries and cemetery symbolism. The City of Austin cemeteries are very near and dear to her heart. We've also got Ora Houston. Ms. Ora Houston is a former council member for Austin District 1, and she served on that council from 2015 to 2019. She's a long-time resident of East Austin and currently lives in the very home her parents built in 1954. She's now retired. She does advocacy work for her neighborhood and when not caring for her plants, bird watching and spending time with her adult children. Ms. Houston was on the city council at the time of the restoration of the Oakwood Chapel was taking place and during the discovery of human remains under the chapel parking lot. And she was proactive in leading the public discussion in response to the discovery. We've got Stephanie Lang, Dr. Stephanie Lang, who's a writer, and she's a community curator and passionate advocate for social justice, who leads equity and community advocacy for the UT Center for Community Engagement. It's a mouthful. Lang has been leading both cultural historic preservation efforts for the CCE for the past year. She's an advocate for community-based heritage preservation, particularly among underrepresented minority communities. Dr. Lang founded Reclaim, an organization that works to discover, recover, and ultimately showcase the narratives and histories of Black people throughout the diaspora and present these findings through artistic and kind of unusual and alternate lens. Dr. Lang also hosts a radio show on KAZI where she spotlights activists, scholars, and artists whose work is centered around Black activity, not only in Austin, but worldwide. Finally, we've got Jane Rivera, who served as a chair for the Austin Parks and Recreation Board for 9 years, ending in 2019. In that role, she helped coordinate the City of Austin Cemetery's master plan and develop plans for the restoration of the Oakwood Chapel Cemetery, or this Cemetery Chapel, excuse me. She's a tireless advocate for historic preservation in Austin and equity in East Austin, particularly in East Austin's minority communities. She and her husband are also co-authors of the 2012 book on Austin's Rosewood neighborhood. So at this point, what I'd like to do is I'd just like to get started and get to the meat of the matter and talk about best management practices. The last session, the last video we saw kind of went over what happened, basically. The order of events, what happened when the city made their discovery under Oakwood Chapel, and how what steps they took moving forward. And I have to say the city is really to be commended at that point. I feel like the city has done a remarkable job in trying to do the best they possibly could with a terrible situation. However, in some of the things that Kim said and some of the comments that were brought up in that video, some of the questions that were asked in that video led me to believe that there were some things that the discovery of human remains was, frankly, unanticipated. And as an archaeologist who's been doing this for more than 20 years, I have to ask, why were those things unanticipated? You know, they shouldn't have been unanticipated for the city. So I think there are some ways that the city could have done better in planning, doing the initial planning. So I want to ask the panelists first, how could what ways could the city, how could the city do better next time when in situations like these, so that they don't get to the planning stage, they don't get all the way through the planning stage of a restoration project like Oakwood Cemetery, the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel, and then all of a sudden discover human remains unanticipatedly. Laura, I'm sorry, Dr. Rivera and Ms. Houston, I'm gonna call on you two first to maybe talk about this, because I know you were both in the thick of things during the course of the discovery. Talk a little bit about where the city might have handled things better.
Well, first of all, I want to tell you how wonderful this symposium has been. I've watched both days and have learned so much regarding exhumation of burials and burials throughout the country. So I want to thank you all for that. The city could have done better by keeping different and better records. There were records that said that we were in the colored section, but there was no indication when we started this project that there were any remains or burials underneath the chapel, and that's because the city didn't capture those. And that, I think the chapel was built back in 1944, and so prior to that time, nobody indicated that there were any burials there. When I got the news in the late November of 2016, my heart stopped. I couldn't breathe because that's holy ground. All cemeteries are holy ground, but when we are reconstructing a chapel and did not know that there were remains and artifacts in that space, that was severe to me. So the first thing that I did is pull together clergy. We didn't know the ethnicity of the folks that had been buried there. And so I pulled together a group of African-American clergy, folks from Our Lady of Guadalupe, and a rabbi to come and have a conversation about what's next from a religious point of view, or faith-based, not just religion, but faith-based point of view. And so that group stayed intact for a while. Then we moved to having a larger community conversation. And Dale Flatt, of course, everybody knows, is Mr. Save Austin Cemeteries. And so he was engaged in having those conversations with the broader community. And we really did have space for people to talk and listen. We did not just say, this is what we think you need to do. We asked questions and people responded to those questions. So although it could have been done differently, if we had known that there were burials underneath the chapel, the issue is that there was no record of that. And so I need to give some kudos to the construction staff and the archaeologists that was on site, because the minute that the artifacts and the burials remains were found, they stopped. And they were so engaged in the process. They were very sensitive to what we were looking at and what we had to do and the time it was going to take. And so both the architects and the construction people were just amazing with this new information that nobody had ever tackled before in East Austin.
Ms. Rivera, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I'd like to give a little bit of background to what happened before Ms. Houston got the call in her council chambers that there were human remains under the project. I was the chair of the board, the Parks Board, in 2012. And in 2012, we started getting all kinds of complaints about things that were going on in the cemeteries. Up until the time that I was on the Parks Board, I was completely unaware that the city's cemeteries were a function of the Parks Department. That's not a real normal thing. And I found out once I got on the Parks Department that there had been a contractor in place since the 1970s who did all of the work managing and maintaining the cemeteries, from doing grounds maintenance to selling plots to opening and closing graves. And so the staff of the Parks Department had mostly been doing contract management in regards to the cemeteries. And there was no one on staff at that time who had a cultural resources background, who would therefore have the knowledge and expertise to deal with any disinterment of human remains. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we spent more than 6 months with park staff, with various stakeholders in the community, and went through every single complaint about cemeteries that the contractor, that the stakeholders, that the neighbors, that the staff had. And we came up with a very detailed spreadsheet of all of those issues and various and sundry possible fixes for all of those. And then as a group, we ended up voting on all the fixes and came up with things that could potentially be done. The cemetery master plan was one of those things. Another thing was, one of the reasons that nothing was getting done up above and beyond the standard normal stuff, including one of the problems was gravestones were knocked over and were never righted. Well, the city did not have the permission to actually write those gravestones in. It takes state approval and a very long process when there are no living relatives to give permission to move a gravestone, even if that's simply sitting it upright from where somebody has knocked it over or an earth tremor has knocked it over. Long story short, it had been put in place in the 1970s with a thing called the perpetual fund. The sales of the lots were supposed to go back into the perpetual fund and pay for all the maintenance. Well, they did, but there were no way enough money to pay for the ongoing maintenance, and the perpetual fund was all but empty at the time that we pulled together this working group to deal with the issues. And so one of the things we did is go to the council and say, look guys, here's the situation. If you want to continue to have complaints about the cemeteries, which is an inappropriate thing to entertain, then leave it as is. Otherwise, you really need to start funding, create an actual fund for cemetery maintenance. And as I said, I'm very proud to have been part of this because we were the catalyst to getting the cemetery program, including the recognition of what needs to be done when human remains are in a cemetery of all places and are found underneath buildings where they should not have been found under normal circumstances. And I would maintain that up until 2015, when the staff hired an archaeologist to be on site to handle any odd thing that might come up, I think that staff really went above and beyond what they knew and did the very best they could to deal with the issue.
So I'm hearing, so we've got bad record keeping historically, which is common in all cities, especially with minority communities. And we've got underfunding of cemeteries and, awareness of these sorts of things. But from where I'm standing, I see that there might be also, a policy issue. Do you think that there was a lack of, a better policy might have created less surprise and taken the city less by surprise than it did, had the city had some better policies governing heritage resources, not just cemeteries, but all heritage resources in place?
Well, as a longtime East Austin resident, married to a lifelong East Austin resident, as Ms. Houston also can testify, the city of Austin has historically and still does lack a strong policy towards preservation of the cultural resources, including human remains, of people of color. And you've got to remember, Austin, part of Texas, was the western edge of the Confederacy. And there are still vestiges of those policies in place that are having to be rooted out. And since Austin is a very rapidly growing city, there's a conflict going on pretty much all the time. In my 40 years in Austin, 40 years actively involved in Austin politics, I have seen over and over again that we lose cases when we try and preserve the home of someone who's truly important to us. For example, the Herrera sisters, who were the first educators in the Austin Independent School District, who were Mexican. And their home was up to be torn down. And it was a horrific fight to get that saved. And that kind of thing happens all the time. So I would concur that you are right in saying that we lack an overall policy as a city that would support always ensuring that you might find remains of poor people who were not marked by markers that are permanent and that sort of thing. And I would agree with you that the larger lack of policy has been a serious problem.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that? So, unmute yourself.
This is not the first time in a project that remains have been located. Transportation projects in particular are well known for unearthing or discovering remains. I do think that the city could have been more centered on possibilities underneath the chapel. Now, it's my understanding that there were no markers, and that is not unusual when you're dealing with a pauper cemetery. In Oakwood altogether, there are still only 3 wooden markers. So wooden markers, and they are cypress. Okay. Wooden markers just don't last a long time. Potentially, the architect of the 1914 chapel thought that there was nothing underneath the footprint where he placed the building. However, whenever the city is going to do work in a cemetery, I think it's very important to do their homework and find ways to discover potential issues. And this was a big issue for the entire city.
I agree with everything my colleagues said. The only thing I would add is I don't know that we know for sure that they didn't know what they were building the chapel on. I don't think we know that. And also, yes, I agree, having some sort of, in addition to the policy and the history with preservation and what areas and communities are valued to be preserved and what aren't, is, Dr. Rivera mentioned, all that is definitely valid and in play here. And I also think another thing that is in play is this idea of having some kind of ongoing strategic plan around this, because the reality is, as it was mentioned, this has happened many times. And even thinking outside of just this incident, we know that there are going to be many and have been many cases where things have been, there's other horrors that have been connected to buildings and parks and, around enslavement, and other horrors is lynching and displacement and dispossession, right? So knowing that those things and the reality of this country and the reality of the state and the reality of the city, these things will continue to happen. So creating some kind of system to address these where we're not kind of caught off guard, I think is paramount and realistic, especially as we know how the city is continuing to be developed.
Mm-hmm. I would absolutely concur.
And I want to agree with what Stephanie has said, and also Jane, because the concern concerns are that it's not just in cemeteries, but as more and more of East Austin becomes invisible because of the loss of physical structure that says people who are brown and browner lived here, worked here, helped build this country, this city, this state. It becomes more and more imperative that we're intentional about making sure that there are markers, but hopefully structure still in place to say these people lived here and contributed, but at least markers to be able to validate the fact that we did belong to this community. And so in life and in death. And so it's important that we do both, and we make sure that we respect and make sure that we are encouraged by the fact that we are able to reinter, I think it's 34 human remains, and say these people were part of this society. We don't know how they were a part of it, but they were integral to this community. You know, we don't know if they were passing through, we don't know that kind of information, but we have to value their lives and the fact that they're here.
Yeah, and I will say also, if I may jump in, it's not just East Austin we're talking about,
No.
all over Austin, because minority communities, minority communities are closely associated with East Austin only after the 1928 master plan, but prior to that time, you had Black communities in Wheatville, Clarksville, downtown Austin, you had Mexican American communities, downtown, all over. I mean, there were communities, different communities of color all over the place. There were Asian, there were Asians in Austin. There were a small community of Asians in Austin. So none of those groups have been necessarily represented very well in commemoration. And then moreover, maybe it's possible that existing policies about historic preservation are just completely erasing the contributions of many of those people. But so what sorts of things, okay, so here's my question, what sorts of things, what can the city do better in the future? What can we do going forward? What sorts of programs should the city put into place? How should the city operate, not just around cemeteries, but for other types of historic sites, for all communities, really, and going forward?
Well, I think that the city should be more intentional about preservation. They have kind of maybe not position on preservation. And when I was on the council and we were having a big conversation about the Grove, which is a huge development in West Austin off of 45th and can't remember the other street, Exposition.
Oak Creek, I live right near it.
We were reminded that the Deaf, Blind, and Orphan School for Colored Children had been there prior to the Austin State School Annex being there. And at that time, we weren't really good about where we would inter people if they died at that facility, because some people were in fact orphans. And we kept getting a lot of mixed messages about whether or not they would even acknowledge that, but certainly not do any kind of archive excavation to see if there were any burials there. And so now we have this huge development on a property that I think it was back in the 1800s that the Deaf DBNO was there. And so that's yet another example of how the city does not take responsibility for the histories of people who were deemed to be not valued.
I would concur totally with what Ms. Houston just said. And I think perhaps a start for a policy would be to convene some of the people who are meeting today to make some written recommendations to the City Council of how to start a program within the city that takes into account the critical historic cultural resources that we may have hidden in, which I'm sure we have, we just don't know exactly where they are hidden within this city, to try and make sure that we don't get surprised in a way that really shouldn't have been a surprise, as this one was.
Mhm.
We have another cemetery issue in a city cemetery that I'd like to bring up. And it is the vandalism over
Yes.
at Evergreen Cemetery.
Mhm.
And thankfully, Parks and Rec jumped right in and said that they will take care of removing that horrible graffiti that was also a desecration of a sacred ground. So I look to the city of Austin and, of course, Parks and Recreation to help not only repair the damage, but to make an outreach to our community, letting people know this is not acceptable. These are our forebears, and don't vandalize the cemeteries. If they can ever find who did this, then there need to be ramifications. So ongoing, Parks and Rec is working on these issues, and I sincerely appreciate that. And so does Save Austin Cemeteries. In fact, right now, we have grant funding to prepare a virtual tour of Evergreen Cemetery.
Cool.
With actors, with very good videography, and that will be prepared and put up on the Parks and Recreation website. And that will be another way that individuals, potentially teachers, can illustrate to their students how to react, how important these resources are.
If I could comment on that, I really have to say, I think Save Austin Cemeteries is a wonderful partner to PARD on the cemeteries. Before I joined the Parks Board, the only way that I had really been exposed to Oakwood Cemetery, besides driving by it to go to work every day, was I attended one of the Halloween tours that Save Austin Cemeteries gave. And I thought it was fascinating and very well done. So thank you.
I wanted to just again reiterate one of the things that was said, that it's really important, I think, for the city to continue, because I know there's some work that's been done, but to continue to provide resources for what was just mentioned. You know, a lot of the experts from this conference, people that can do symposium, that can do work around these histories, right? We know that this is here, and we know how, unfortunately, a lot of this history, this information was not valued and archived the way it should be. So getting ahead of that by having folks doing this work is really important. I mean, a lot of my work is around freedom colonies, and I know that, you know, people have just talked about several being discovered recently, right? And learning about, you know, Latinx, Black and Brown communities that were, you know, that were there that we didn't even know about, right? We're still learning this, right, in 2020. So, and these are very dedicated people doing this work, but we need more resources and more support, more focused efforts, really unearthing this.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with all of you, Dr. Lang. I especially agree with what you're saying. I want to circle back to all of this, but before we do, there have been a couple of questions asked in the chat, so I want to get to a few of those. And I'm not sure if we are the right group to answer it, but I think one person asked whether anyone considered just knocking down the chapel. And you know, during the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel restoration project, whether anyone considered just knocking down the chapel and redevoting that land exclusively to grave memorials. Ms. Houston or, Dr. Rivera, the two of you might be the best to answer that question.
There was no real discussion of completely deconstructing the chapel. There was some recommendation that we move the chapel from Oakwood over to Memorial Cemetery. That was not historically accurate, so we said no, that was not something that we were planning to do. But there was no real conversation about deconstructing the chapel.
And I would concur, the board never talked about that either.
Hi, everyone. This is Kim McKnight. I was asked to sort of jump in.
Thank you, Kim.
This ties, we did have a suggestion. I mean, I was, as I mentioned in my section before this, we had some folks who suggested that it would be appropriate to either relocate the chapel to another cemetery or take the chapel down. It was not a resounding opinion, but it certainly was an opinion. So I just want to be clear that we had a lot of different questions and suggestions.
There was another question here I also want to address real quick. Somebody asked whether it was possible to reach out to local funeral parlors when human remains were discovered under the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel. Was it possible to reach out to local funeral parlors and community members, old buried newspapers, oral histories that might reference, and people with family Bibles that might reference who those people were that were buried under there? My guess is that that was all part of the investigation, archaeological investigations that later ensued, but can any of you speak to that directly?
One thing I want to go ahead. Please go ahead.
Just quickly, we had community meetings where all people were included, including clergy, members of descendant communities. We invited the board of Parks and Rec board people came, Save Our Cemeteries was there. And so we would sometimes have very large meetings of the public with very different views on the way we should go. And so this was not something that was done in private or a few people making decisions. People came up with a lot of good suggestions. And I think that the Parks and Recreation Department, the construction people, and the architects did a really great job in doing both and. We were able to recover the remnants. We're going to get some more information on them, and then we will hopefully be able to reinter them together because we unearthed them together. That would be my preference, is that we inter them together at some point in the future.
One thing I want to point out is that when these individuals were discovered, one of the primary reasons that we so widely publicized the meetings that we were having that spring is that we could not rule out the possibility that somebody within our community had some kind of oral history about their family member being buried and then having a chapel, built on top of that burial. And so we thought it was fully conceivable that we would have people coming forward saying, I have always grown up being told that my great-great-great-grandmother was interred here or somebody passed here. So one of the reasons we held those meetings and publicized them so widely was with the hope that we could potentially locate descendant community members. So I just want to point out that was part of the hope. But of course, we are so many years removed, and that didn't happen. But that was what we were hoping.
Victor?
The cemetery, Oakwood Cemetery, and the chapel are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Therefore, tearing down a building within the cemetery might have jeopardized that National Register status. And I know we discussed this at Save Austin Cemeteries, and we felt that it was very important to restore the chapel and not tear it down and not remove it to another place, that would have been pretty much an abrogation of the
Yeah.
National Register status.
The Oakwood Cemetery Chapel is in fact itself historic and is very much a part of the story, the story
Yes, it is.
told in the Oakwood Cemetery. And so it's my understanding that that's also why ultimately it was decided not to tear down the chapel, but to renovate it, because it's a very important aspect of the cemetery.
But
As are the burials themselves.
But I think it's really important not to disregard what I think is a very valid feeling, which is that the burials that are there are far more historic than the chapel. And I think that you can argue very reasonably that they were there first and what happened then was wrong. And I think it's a valid sentiment that somebody would want to see the chapel moved. And we genuinely talked about, I mean, there was no perfect solution. And so I think we really just had to validate all of those sentiments, because I think that was very fair. And I think and as I have a master's degree in historic preservation, and I really struggled with this to say, I can see how somebody would think that we're trying to put a building literally above a person, like figuratively and literally. And I have to be honest, it was a struggle to really, and we really validated those sentiments and tried to give them, everything is documented in our report so that people could see all of those different opinions. And so I want to point that out.
This is Laura. I just wanted to interrupt to interject that there is another question in the chat regarding a statement that Kim made earlier. When you say exhumation was recommended by our community, do you mean the descendant community, or are you mixing that designation with municipal and scientific communities that are white?
That's a great question. The trickiest part about this process was that, unlike other situations where there might have been a clear sense of the race or ethnicity of the individuals buried, we didn't have definitive knowledge. We knew that we were dealing with a section of the cemetery that had historically been referred to as the colored grounds, and we knew that that word colored could incorporate really non-white. We also knew that there were a lot of class issues around this area of the cemetery, and that the people of extreme poverty might be buried here, people traveling through town would be buried here, but we certainly didn't have good records to support that. What reaching out to Councilmember Houston, was our first move to really help us connect with the African American community. And I think our feeling at the time was that that was the most likely group that we would have affiliations with. We did have members of Save Austin Cemeteries that came forward with records that said, don't be so quick. You've got real records of a real variety of people here. And that was tricky for us because, we're not here to we don't have the science. We haven't done the reports. I will say this, that the people who really supported this idea of leaving the burials in place and continuing to restore the chapel, by and large, were white individuals who were citing examples in Europe of Westminster Abbey. And through that process, ultimately, we did reach out to what we thought was a very clear representative of this community, and that was Lambeth Fontaine, who is a descendant of Jacob Fontaine, and Tanja Walls Davis, our cemetery manager, who's really just a terrific resource. She's worked in the funeral home industry in East Austin for many years, was able to connect us with this descendant of Jacob Fontaine. And we were able to really ask him literally on the phone, like, we really want to hear what you think should happen here. And he let us know that he felt it was more appropriate to exhume and reinter and not have people under a building. So I would say that the exhumation was recommended by predominantly the African American descendant community. I think it would be fair to say that perhaps we preference that opinion over some of the white voices, and I don't mind saying that. But we also looked at the scientific community's recommendation and precedent cases, and all of that really tipped the needle toward exhumation. And we kind of laid it all out, tried to show all of this information, conferred with Councilmember Houston, conferred with the staff leadership. To move towards exhumation meant a year delay of the construction project and funds that we simply didn't have. So there was certainly a financial impact, but I will say the city supported that recommendation.
This brings me back. So that last question was a great one, and I missed that in the queue. Sorry, but this brings us back to the main point of this conversation, and that's best management practices. Public involvement. How important is public involvement, and what sorts of public involvement should the city be doing for all kinds of projects in the future?
I can't speak to all city projects, but I know how important it is to get the community surrounding a project included in the conversations. With the situation that we're in with COVID-19 and everything being done by Zoom, many of our elders in my community specifically don't have the resources or the technology or the ability to Zoom in and give their opinion. They're much more comfortable having those kind of conversations in a place where they feel safe and part in their community. So as we begin to look at other projects that the city may tackle, the number one is include the community. Don't just include people who think this is a good idea, but make sure through all means necessary that the community is encouraged to participate. That's radio, because people do listen to radio. Some people don't do social media, but they listen to radio, send flyers, make the churches aware. We did all of those kinds of things to ensure that the people who were not on various social media platforms had an opportunity to come and listen and understand what the process was looking like at that point. And I think that's always the best thing to do when you're going to impact somebody around a project, is make sure they are clear and that they understand what the issues are. And they have a say, because they live there. We don't. People who make decisions don't live in those areas. So we've got to make sure that the people who surround those projects understand what is going to happen and how they can continue to be involved.
Yes, I agree. Definitely. And how you engage the community, many times when there's kind of multiple communities and stakeholders, there's not this one blanket way to engage with everybody, right? So kind of being flexible and acknowledging, the cultural and all the different ways that could be impacted, right? So I think that's really important. I've, been connected to projects when there's been kind of several different communities that were impacted or, targeted by this. And they oftentimes people will just focus on one, which can be problematic. And then if they do it in a way, it's just blanket, right? The other thing is often our communities are not monoliths. So I think that there is a way in which when we do engage, we kind of are talking to the same folks over and over and thinking about expanding that and thinking outside of this box and how we're defining who the leaders are. And not everybody from one community is in one area anymore. So just really thinking, mindfully about like how we engage with folks.
And I think that Ms. Houston touched upon something that we need to really be mindful of. You cannot do all of your community engagement online, even assuming that everybody has access to a computer. They may not check it all the time because they're working at hours when you might expect them to be checking the computer. I think we really have to get back to doing things like putting leaflets in the mail, having people leaflet a community if there is something that's going to be affecting potential residents of a particular community. Just trying every alternate route instead of just putting things on the website or sending out an email.
I'd also just quickly add, if you already are kind of involved in some engagement around the community, it makes it a lot easier when, you know, these difficult situations come up to then be like, oh, hey, you know, this is happening, we need to address this with you all. And, you know, I know this is something that's important to the city. So I would say continuing to make sure that you're engaging with the community and all the communities, so that when these things come up, there's already this kind of entree, there's already this connection, you already have a relationship with the people that you should, when we have to have these conversations.
And it's also about trust. Having trust in what the city is saying to the people at large. You have to work on trust. You can't just assume that people trust you just because you say, I'm with the city of Austin, and this is what we think is what's best for you. You've got to develop and establish and maintain trust. And that's sorely lacking these days.
I say an amen to that.
Rachel, there was a question that was brought up in an earlier session that I felt was more appropriate for this session to discuss. And it has to do with the headstone that was removed, that was adjacent to the chapel. And it was removed during the restoration and not replaced. And so the question reads, do you think it is important to reinstall displaced headstones promptly after construction projects and not keep them in storage for years afterward?
I think I can answer that if you'd like, Rachel.
Yeah, I was going to suggest one of our panelists answer, but if you have, please.
Well, I know exactly which headstone this is, and I certainly don't want to take away from any of the other panelists, but we did have a headstone of a gentleman named Mr. Dario Nunez. It's a 25-year-old who passed away at, I think, about 1885, of Mexican American or Mexican descent, and his gravestone was removed during construction. We've made the decision to wait until we're finished with the reinterment process, because we will still have machinery and people you know, moving about, and it's kind of isolated and it'd be very easy to damage. So we do have every intention to reinstall that headstone. I know our community is eager, and I just want to assure anyone out there that's worried about it that we will address it. So thank you I just want to speak to that specific one.
This does actually bring up something that I did want to ask the panelists, and I'm hoping that the panelists will talk about a little bit about. It's about timing, and timing, you know, and timing different kinds of outreach efforts and public involvement, and making announcements about particular making announcements about a project, when to share information with the public, and when to hold on to it in order to really understand what you're dealing with first. That comes up a lot during projects like this. It sounds like it came up a lot. It came up a little bit during the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel restoration, is kind of timing of the dissemination of the information. What is the best timing for it? How transparent and when should a city be, or the city of Austin be on future projects?
Well, after the notification in 2016, as I said, we had a meeting with the clergy in 2017 in March, and they were continuing to excavate and find other articles and remains. And so as soon as we had a clear picture of how many, we had a press conference. And that was in March. And so as fast as we have information, we had information, we disseminated that to the public. And I think that's the right way to do that, because otherwise you have different people giving their interpretation of what the reality is, and the narrative gets taken away from the city of Austin. So I think as fast as you know something and it's concrete, the scientists have looked at it, everybody understands we've got 34 remains and some artifacts, then we need to let people know that.
I agree wholeheartedly. It's very important to let your audience know about discoveries, but they have to be verified first. Sometimes, particularly in an archaeological situation, you find elements that could come into question. On a highway project I was working on, for instance, there was a tombstone in a man's yard. Well, we had to approach the man before it was ever disclosed. We approached the man to ask him, why is this in your yard? And he told us it belonged to his uncle, and somebody else made a different one for the graveyard. Well, there wasn't a burial in this man's yard. And so it was never really made public, because upon verification, there was no actual burial. So I think it's very important to engage your citizenry, particularly when it's a public project, after verification.
You know, I can just add, as somebody in the public sector, we really struggle to time things. And I think often people are upset if you go too fast, and they're upset if you go too slow. And people have different expectations of what is reasonable. And so I've been on both ends in my more than 2 decades of community development work and historic preservation and planning work. Projects I've worked on have been accused of going too fast or too slow. And so it can be, I just want to provide that perspective and say that I think the truth is always somewhere in the middle, as with all things, and so it can be tricky.
I agree, and I think what I was kind of getting at, and I'm hoping maybe some other people can talk about, is that sometimes the idea of verification as somebody who might be intimately involved in a project as the expert or as the technician, you want to make sure you know what you're dealing with. But you also, if you don't disclose discoveries soon enough, you run the risk of being accused of making arbitrary decisions about what's important and what's not. You know, and I think that's something that we as historic preservationists have faced very often, is that we kind of is that we set ourselves up as experts sometimes a little too heavily at the expense of communities who also want input into the meaning and into developing a meaning and understanding, or a meaning and understanding of certain finds. In terms of, what do our other panelists have to say about that?
Well, I'd like to address that as an activist. I have been a community activist for quite a few decades now. And I think that one example that we just talked about a few minutes ago is a good example of how community people may think that you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes in some way if you don't give them some kind of an answer. The gravestone that was not put back in place. That question could have come from somebody who thought that they might have known somebody who was related to the individual. And they're thinking, why has this person's gravestone not been put in place? And in lieu of the professional answer, which is, we're going to do it, but we're going to do it when we have all the equipment there and all of that, that may not have been communicated to the community. And so people in the community are thinking, oh, well, that's just the city of Austin again. They've taken that gravestone away and we'll never see it. And that is disrespectful to this gentleman. And that's typical of the way the system works. And so I can see that perspective. And the question then becomes, at what point and in what manner do you share information with the community as a whole? And I think that that's one of the things that the city needs to do better. And I realize that that's a very difficult situation because it's the way you do better is by being more transparent all the time about everything. And that kind of opens you up to even more community questions, because then you have all of everybody all over the place coming up with their own possible reasons for why you're doing this. And so it creates a storm of more questions to have to answer. But I still think a greater amount of transparency is probably the only answer that really gets at the truth.
Yeah, I agree. And I, again, also recognize what you're saying, Kim, and that this is like a balancing act. But transparency, in my understanding, is not saying we're coming with all the information, but it's saying this is what's happening and this is where we are.
Yes.
We want you to be aware of that. And that in itself is powerful, it's important, it's respectful, it's necessary.
Toward that end, we also have a comment from in the question and in the Q&A panel here. Somebody wasn't satisfied with the city's explanation about what's happening with the headstone. So, and I think Dr. Rivera kind of went over it a little bit too and said, well, one of the reasons why this headstone hasn't been put back right away is because we're waiting for the right, it's because you're waiting for the right time. Can you maybe address that a little more, Kim, possibly about why, what is the city's rationale in waiting to replace this headstone that was excavated as part of the Oakwood Chapel?
It's a really small headstone, and so we because we're going to have reinterment taking place, and we're going to have people working and trying to find places to bury and reinter these individuals from beneath the chapel and in that immediate area. We didn't want it to be damaged, but it was its exact location was GPSed and is recorded, and we've been fairly vocal, but in giving it some thought through this panel, one of the things that we could do, and I think I'll talk to the team, is maybe a sign at that location, just kind of letting people know, rather than continuing to restate it over and over again, would give people a sense of, okay, whew, it's going to be back. So I think that's something I'm in hearing this and kind of hearing the community voices here. I think that maybe having an on-site sign to let people know that we want to protect it, and that's why it's not being put back up. So that's something that we could do, I think.
I wish we had more definite answers about where we were going to reinter. That is the first spot adjacent to that grave that we're investigating. And it may or may not work out, because we're not going to, of course, reinter in a place where there are already burials. There might be other areas that we also need to investigate, which is really the purpose for Amanterra Environmental joining us as consultants as they work with us to, make a very difficult determination. But that is our first choice. If we're able to reinter them as close to the location where they were found, it would be our first preference. But there's much work to be done, archaeological work to be done, to determine that that is the best spot. And it is adjacent to that grave. So with that, I'm going to thank each of you for your participation. and thank our participants out in Zoom world for hanging in there um, and being with us in the Ethernet for 2 days. We appreciate all that you gave, all that we learned from not only our professionals, but from our community members through the questions that you asked. And there's more to come. This won't be the last conversation. There are many more to come, but I hope that someday we'll be able to be around the table personally, having these conversations. We look forward to that day. And, you know, sincerely,